Climate change and the environment are the defining issues of our times. They need our urgent attention and action. But how we inform, educate and engage people on climate change and environmental harms in a way that catalyses transformational change has still not been established. Most people develop their awareness of climate change and environment from the media. This means that understanding how journalists all over the world are reporting on these issues and what they need to amplify their work is now essential. I'm Gabby McAtter. I'm a lecturer in journalism at Deakin University here in Melbourne, Australia. I'm a former journalist and I currently teach and research journalism. In my work, I look particularly at media coverage of climate change and the environment. I investigate how media drive the ways we act or fail to act in relation to climate change and environmental harms. Most recently, our research team has been working with Internews and the Earth Journalism Network to examine in detail the current state of climate change and environmental journalism globally. We wanted to know what journalists need to increase their capacity to report on the environment and on climate change, and what role media support organisations can play in amplifying this work right across the planet. We believe this is the largest ever truly global study of journalists who report on climate change and the environment. 744 journalists from 102 countries responded to our survey, which was deployed in 11 languages. We also interviewed 74 journalists in 31 countries. I'd like to share with you some of the key findings of this research. The journalists that we engaged with felt that coverage of climate change and the environment has increased in the last decade. They also thought that it was given more prominence in the media, sometimes making front-page news. Journalists thought this was mainly due to increasing environmental harms and also because of greater public interest. Journalists in almost every country said that NGO and philanthropic support of journalism was a key factor in amplifying their work. They said that without this support, much climate and environmental journalism might never happen. Journalists in almost every country told us that a lack of resources still limits their coverage of climate and environmental issues. We know that this is particularly the case in lower income countries where professional precarity is a lived experience of many journalists. And there is much work to be done. Journalists that we interviewed told us that the volume of coverage of climate change is still far too small given the seriousness of the problem. Journalists said that in some countries, audiences' understanding of climate change as a global phenomenon remained very limited, making it hard for them to convey this complex issue. Across almost all countries, journalists said that linking climate change, environment and health was how they were most likely to approach their climate and environmental reporting. Some of the other key themes journalists reported on were deforestation, water, plastic pollution and government policy. There's been a lot of debate recently about whether journalists covering climate change and environment should actively advocate for particular action, given the urgency of dealing with environmental problems and the slow pace of change. Our research found that most journalists feel uncomfortable being advocates. Instead, almost all journalists said that they adhere to the professional norm of objectivity, even though objectivity in journalism has itself been questioned. One of the most surprising findings from the research is that the concept of balance is still being used in many countries as a reason to include climate-skeptical sources in reporting about climate change. Quite a large majority of journalists we surveyed across multiple countries reported including statements from sources that deny climate science in the name of balance. This means that in many countries, media audiences are being led to believe that the causes of climate change are not clear or that necessary responses to climate change have not been agreed on. This is highly problematic when widespread public understanding of the causes and impacts of climate change is so urgently needed to support climate action on a global scale. Maybe the most positive finding of this research is that many journalists said they had seen impact and change as a result of their work. This was mostly on the level of audiences, including better public understanding, though some journalists reported their work had catalysed government policy change. This is just a snapshot of the months of investigations, conversations and connections between journalists and journalism researchers. This research found a thriving, vibrant and dedicated community of journalists committed to telling stories about our planet all over the world. But this is a landscape with challenges that demands more funding, more training and more access to sources and more expert connections to help journalists everywhere tell the most important story of our time.